EPP, delegation leader of the CDA, power woman of the EPP, and Harmen Verbruggen, Professor Emeritus of International Environmental Economics at the VU. I'm very happy to have you both. Thanks for coming here. On Monday, the BBC aired a special of their Panorama series. It was called Climate Change, What Can We Do? And it featured a British family of 4 that was followed for 2 weeks, helped by specialists to reduce their carbon footprint. And the net result after 2 weeks was that they had reduced it by 25%. However, that included driving an electric car of £30,000, which they cannot afford, eating an insect burger, which the kids didn't like, and they would need, we were told, a heat pump that would cost £30,000 as well. And then the father exclaims, "Do we have a money tree somewhere there in the garden?" And on carbon emissions, the mother was the worst offender. She flew to Nashville, Tennessee for her 40th birthday, they found out, with a friend. Shame on her. Here is in a mini-universe the problem of climate change policies and the middle class. We want it, but the middle class doesn't want it or cannot afford it. And this affordability crisis is made worse, I think, by initiatives such as the Behavior Change Report by the British government, which points at the change in lifestyle that people need to make. But at the same time saying, well, as a public you can do only so much. Most needs to come from elsewhere. And this reminds me of a classical biblical story of Jesus blaming the Pharisees, experts of the law, saying, "Woe to you, lawyers, for you load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." And I hear this also in the problems of the middle class with climate policies. Substitute burden with carbon tax, experts of the law with climate scientists, and you have your modern day problem. It's not that they're not right, but it's a problem that this burden is there and people feel it. Middle class households feel this pressure, working life, family life, caring for others, and then we need to do something with climate change policies, which might make our life a little bit harder. And a large fraction of the middle class think that their children will be less well off than they are. This squeezing the middle even more. I think this is an issue, I'm just raising it as a problem. That's the starting point for this panel debate. What could we do? What is going on? Now, I will just briefly say the 3 questions I stated in the description of this panel, what I've sent the panelists as well. I think there are three issues. One is that of polarization. There's a paper which asks people, how much risk do you believe climate change poses to human health, safety or prosperity? So do you believe this is really an issue? It turns out, if you split the groups into 2, highly educated and not so high educated, I'm using a little bit of a shortcut here, then the people who think climate change is not a serious issue, opposed to the group who does think it's a serious issue, the difference will become larger for better educated people. So you would think being more literate means you understand better what the problem is, or you might think it's more serious, but actually the opposite happens. That is a real problem if you talk about polarization. It's not just populists polarizing people, but there's something going on in our mind if we talk about climate change. And it also means that if we do more communication, or if the European Commission will do more communication, climate change is a danger, it might not help. It might be perceived as propaganda. Okay, first problem. Second problem, trust in the government. I was in another panel about the middle class in Czechia, the Czech Republic. 60% of the people have little trust in political institutions. If the government is going to take the lead in climate change policies, How will that work if people do not trust the government? And so maybe the question is not how do we get politicians to make ambitious goals? Maybe we need to find ways to regain trust. If we don't, new plans or promises could sow the seeds of disappointment already. Democracy might be on a knife edge. So polarization, trust in the government. Third one, what is the we in if we say we should do more? The incoming European Commission has an ambitious agenda of a European Green Deal. Net zero emissions by 2050. How is it going to do it? Is it going to be with extra regulations, government interventions? Is that going to work? And how do we prevent it from being very technocratic, but rooted in, well, people's lives and the way firms operate? So I mentioned one idea in the description of the panel. How do you involve businesses in the normal way they operate? We believe in free entrepreneurship. It's the basis of our economy. How do you free up all that energy that's in the business world? And I quoted the Bible text at the beginning. I think this is fitting when the climate problem is taking on biblical proportions. Worldwide, 100 years. But the biblical theme that also contains hope. Maybe this is not really a new problem at all. Since the start of civilization, there are collective problems that we all need to face up to. And maybe we should look a bit further than just policy X or Y, but take a step back before we can take a step forward. That's what I hope we can talk about today. Let me summarize the 3 questions. So how do we bridge polarization? How can trust be restored? Third, how can we create some ownership of this climate problem among the middle class, or the places where people can actually do something? Thank you. And then, yeah. I will now give the floor to Esther de Lange.
Yes.
Yes.
There, okay. Just making sure that I'm not speaking through 2 mics. Thank you very much, and thanks to the Wilfried Martens Center, as well as the Dutch Scientific Institute of the CDA for organizing this session. And I think it's excellent that we're talking about the issue of climate change and climate policies, which we as parties weren't always comfortable with. Just to give you an example, out of the European campaign, we knew from research done at EPP level that the climate issue was among the top 3 issues of concern among voters in all our member states. So yes, sure, they wanted to talk about migration and security. Of course, it is also the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton always used to say. But among the top 3 of issues of key concern for the European, and when we discuss the appropriate level of government that is relevant for the European elections, in all member states, climate came into the top 3. Yet I'm quite sure that we had a lot of spin doctors in our parties, that we had a lot of communication advisors in campaigns that said, oh, don't talk about climate change. Try to talk about migration, try to talk about security and the economy, but avoid climate change. I'm giving the sound man a headache, I think. Is it okay? Okay. So a lot of the spin doctors saying avoid the subject, which I think we shouldn't do, because we have, as middle parties, as center-right parties, an excellent story to tell, and maybe more on that later. But let me first say that often climate change and climate policy is seen as a threat, and the introduction already, took up on that as well. The middle class is already squeezed, and now they also have to do climate. This is kind of a reasoning that you hear a lot. There's 2 elements in that. Yes, the middle class is squeezed. So first of all, maybe before we touch climate, we as central parties, middle, center-right parties, should have a discussion about how we make sure that this squeezing of the middle class that has been going on for decades in the US as well as in the EU, no big difference between the 2, by the way, should be addressed. There's this famous report by McKinsey, which is called Poorer Than Their Parents, which pretty much shows that the current young generation is the first generation that in terms of disposable income, even after the rather elaborate corrections we make through our tax system, etc., in Europe, still has less disposable income than the generations before them, which is a worrying tendency in itself, even without the issue of climate change at the table. And that links to what is often called the fear of falling. Even if you personally don't have the impression that you are currently worse off than a generation of your parents, you will say, I'm doing well, but we are not so well. This fear of falling, the fear that it can hit you soon, or it can hit your family soon, this degradation of conditions in your life is very much a part of the current mood, I would say, among a lot of our voters. And how do you address that? The figures are there. One of the think tanks of the European Commission has shown, for example, that the percentage of people that struggle, of families that struggle to pay their energy bill, has actually not gone down after the crisis finished. So it was around 7% in Europe before the crisis hit. Then you had the economic crisis and it went up to about 12. It's currently still above 10. So this is 10% of ordinary, middle-of-the-road European households struggling to pay for their gas, for their electricity, for their water bills. This is all part of this middle class, which in a way warrants a discussion in itself. But I kind of want to move away from the fatalistic thesis, which is to say, oh, the poor middle class is squeezed and now they have to do climate. And why? I am still, in a way, quite optimistic, because I do believe that we have a human, or some would call it God-given, but at least an intrinsic and basic need or desire to look after our surroundings. You love your children from the minute they are born, and you have an intrinsic need to look after your immediate environment. And I think this is the basis on which Christian democratic or center-right climate policy should be based on. So not abstract targets or being green for the sake of being green, that is the new religion among the green political families, but actually tapping into this basic need that is in every human being. And that's a very positive thing, because it's in all of us. And that leads me to three things that I think climate policy for the middle, if you can make climate policy for the middle classes, by the way, it should basically be good climate policy. But three basic things that I think climate policy at all political levels should do. And the first thing is you help the small. So you tap into this intrinsic basic need of wanting to look after your immediate surroundings. And therefore, you also need very local policies. And a national government needs to be more the enabler of local initiative, as should the European, than trying to rule it all from the top. I think that is very, very important. And we might need some changes also at the European level. If I look at where a lot of the subsidies, for example, for renewable energies are going, it's to the big, classical energy companies. Yet, a rural collective in the northern province of Friesland with a brilliant plan to have a small energy cooperative right behind their water cleaning facility, i.e. in an area where there's not a lot of people doing recreation, nicely hidden by trees, at the scale perfect for the villages concerned, they struggle to get their initiative off the ground. And I think that's wrong. And why do I think that is wrong? Because of the second element that good climate policy fulfills or delivers, and that is you need to take people along. So you help the small. Second, you need to take people along. And this is linked to this inbuilt fear of falling. we as a society are doing badly. The burden is on those who can't carry the burden. And it might not hit me now, but it might hit me or my family later. And this has to do with making sure that no country, no region, no group of people is left behind. I will give you one example from my own policy experience, and that was the review in the last mandate of the ETS rules. Now, this was a highly polarized also issue where a lot of people thought they had seen the light and they were the only believers in the true faith and that things should be done in a certain way. And it's very easy to say that coming from a founding member state, having all this experience in European policy making and having already closed our coal mines in the 1960s. By the way, the region where I come from, which is the region in the Netherlands where these coal mines were, is still economically behind the rest of the Netherlands. So let's not pretend that all of this is easy. And what I meant with taking people along is that we can only have successful policy at European level or elsewhere if we make sure that no region is left behind. So yes, when we did the reform of the ETS system, and we were criticized by some that it was not quickly enough, but we managed to have a country like Poland, which initially said, I don't want to do anything. We managed to have them sign up to the ETS reform, which has resulted in an increase of the price per ton of CO2 from 5 euros per ton when we started, now at 27. And by the way, this legislation still has to come into force because it will come into force next year. So I expect the price to go up further. And we did it by saying, okay, we understand. I mean, my region in the Netherlands still sees the consequences of the mines closing down. We can't pretend that that is not the case. We see that it will hit a country like Poland if we stop coal production. Therefore, we help you with considerable support, for example, in the short term, to revamp the city heating in cities like Warsaw and so on. If you go to the outskirts of those cities, a lot of them in the former communist building blocks, it's still centralized heating, which is basically if you're hot, open a window. You know, 20% of our CO2 emissions are from buildings, so we can in the short term really help. And this is what we did. And it costs money, but you make sure that you leave no country behind. You take everybody along. And this addresses this fear of falling, and it is key. And this is also the key question to First Vice President Frans Timmermans, and really a fundamental one. Is he going to be the climate prophet from the West, from a relatively rich founding member state, saying we have a Dutch climate law, which I will now copy-paste to the European level, and this is how it shall all be done? Then you don't take people along, then you don't address the fear of falling, and you're doing bad policy. So this is fundamental for the 5 years to come. Take people along. And then the third, and here strong government comes in. Because if you want to help the small, if you want to take people along, the EU has to play it big. That means that it cannot, no, let me put it this way. The EU has to play it big and has to use what is called its normative power. The power we all know of the EU lies in its ability to change the international community's idea of the norm. Can we still set the norm? And this is of key importance because, of course, I can't convince a Dutch person to stop flying if the Amazon is burning, if China is not in a way committed to curbing its emissions. So here, Europe has to step up. And it is what President Juncker has called in one of his final interviews recently, Weltpolitikfähigkeit. You know, if you play German Scrabble, go, Weltpolitikfähigkeit. But are we able to set the norm by acting and giving the good example ourselves, but also demanding a return from others? That's Weltpolitikfähigkeit. Are we able to set the norm? And all these three elements should go together, otherwise we won't be able to deliver. And one of the ideas I have there is to say climate is therefore also diplomacy, is therefore also high representative. wherever our high representative goes, climate should also be on the agenda. He should not only be talking to the traditional AFET committee in the European Parliament, he should come to the Environment Committee after every foreign trip and tell us what he has done in the area of Europe playing it big in order to be able to take people along and to deliver for the small. Thank you very much.
Okay. Finally, Harmen Verbruggen.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I would like to tell you something about the recent experience in the Netherlands with our new climate plan. The government formulated a climate plan in response to the climate law for the coming 5 years, and that has been sent to, but I don't know the English translation of Raad van State, Council of States, but that's don't think the proper.
Advisory Council.
Yeah, but it's a very old advisory council dated back to the 17th century. The king is heading the council, but he's never present. And they asked me for advice, but that's confidential. So they sent me the climate plan, in the Council of States, Raad van State, they're all lawyers and are not very familiar with climate change policies. So, what is it all about? Although, of course, also in the Netherlands there is a widespread recognition of the seriousness of climate change, there is, as we experience, less willingness to bear the cost and change lifestyle in response to climate policies. And this seems to be especially true of lower and middle income classes. It is a generalization, I have to admit, and it is more based on my personal impression, but I attended quite a number of local panel discussions in Dutch municipalities. Last Monday, for instance, in Woerden, that's the average municipality in the Netherlands. But the lower income groups then, and that's my experience, are rather indifferent. Climate change is too complex, and they don't have any action perspective available. Middle income groups, by contrast, have various options available. Options to reduce their climate change impact by changing their transport and commuting modality and other consumption pattern. As homeowner, they can take insulation measures or by choosing nearby holiday destinations. But it's already been mentioned, they simply argue that's how they react. Yes, this comes above all other things we have to do. Why we again? That's the general reaction. They point at the agricultural sector, the farmers, the big energy intensive firms, such as oil refineries, chemical industries, aviation, iron and steel companies, with their huge smoking chimneys. They should take their share first. We as middle income groups are already heavily burdened, and their way of life, the way of life of middle income groups, is quite busy, squeezed as it is called here. They simply cannot afford CO2 reducing measures. In addition, they are too busy with all their daily affairs, and then now they have to spend time on sustainable energy options. Above all, and I think that's very important, and I slightly exaggerate, their way of life, with their way of life, they want to keep up with their neighbors and their colleagues. This peer pressure plays a very important role, especially when we're talking about leisure and holidays. They are rather reluctant to change. Let me share an example of a trade-off that has to be made by a middle-income family with 2 kids. They've got some savings of about, say, 5,000 euros. That's the average family. Climate policies compel them, at least in the Netherlands, to insulate their house to save energy use. That is the first measure they have to take. Thereafter, they have to look for an alternative heating device instead of their standard heating boiler, which what they use now, because their house will be disconnected from the natural gas system in due course. But they don't know when. And they aren't either aware of an alternative heating system yet. But first, insulation. I would say that is a no-regret option. They have also the possibility to participate in a local community initiative to install solar panels on their roof. But both expenses, insulation and solar panels, are economically sound, with a payback time somewhere between 5 to 10 years. The financial return, on average, is somewhere between 8 and 10%, and that's much higher than you can get on your savings account nowadays if you put your money there. However, their 2 kids, want to go on a vacation, preferably to a Greek island by plane. Their friends go there too, but they only have 5,000 euros. All 3 initiatives at the same time is impossible. So they have to choose. Most likely, they go for the summer holiday. From a climate point of view, and also economically, their decision is unwise. And 2 phenomena play a role here, and that's what I would like to explain. The first is, in general, mankind is myopic, short-sighted, and our family is no exception. Mankind prefers short-time pleasure to long-term gains. In fact, this is at the heart of environmental degradation. And it is particularly relevant to climate change policies, given its very long nature, far beyond the lifespan of people that live today. The second issue has to do with communication. The societal discussion and the communication on climate change policies is darkened, poisoned, distorted by the use of an unclear and in fact wrong concept of cost. Mention is always made of the cost of climate policies for household or industry by politicians and the media alike. A distinction is then often made between the cost for different economic sectors at the one hand and the cost for households at the other end. With respect to the cost for households, the distributional impact of the various policy measures is further disaggregated and analyzed. No income category may suffer too much. The costs have to be shared equally, and there is always something about fairness and justice. However, if we limit ourselves to households, then a clear distinction has to be made between cost and investment. Both are expenses, but not all expenses are cost. A summer holiday is a cost. The money is spent and gone. At best, it is a short-term investment in well-being, but a very short term. Paying for house insulation and the installation of solar panels is an investment. It's a paying conduct of business, with, as already indicated, a payback time of somewhere between 5 to 10 years. After recouping the initial investment, the house insulation remains You cannot undo it. And the solar panels remain in operation for at least another 15 years. That means energy for free. The value of their houses increase, more or less equal to the value of their investment. That comes out of recent research. In my opinion, it is a challenge to communicate this difference between cost and investment to the general public. In addition, and that's in fact the problem, the time discrepancy has to be overcome. With the help of the banking sector, perhaps in public-private partnerships, new financial instruments have to be developed, and there are already a few in operations, to overcome the burden of pre-financing. Sometimes direct income subsidies or tax reliefs are necessary for lower and middle income groups because, as it presently stands, not all sustainable energy devices are yet competitive and involve additional investment costs. Apart from financial incentives, households have to be involved in the introduction of sustainable energy options in their neighborhoods. Are we going, and that is still unclear, are we going for a central district heating or full electrification or a system based on hydrogen or so-called heat pumps or whatever? In that respect, advice and reliable information is needed to be able to participate for the people. Confusion and unrest have to be prevented. And at the moment, there is a lot of nonsense going around, especially spread by the so-called populist parties. Finally, climate measures are not only about money, but also about time. It takes time to sort out the available options. It is time-consuming, and there is uncertainty. People need to be properly informed with adequate information and offered sound guidance on policies and procedures. So the most important thing, in my opinion, is that climate policy measures have to be made financially attractive. They are investments, and we have to overcome the pre-financing problem, and they have to be unburdened, so to say. That's the only way, in my opinion, as Esther de Lange called it, to take the people along. Otherwise, they become cynical, and that's the last thing, of course, we want. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, both. What a lot of stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
Maybe I should ask this question about polarization. Do you think polarization will go away, Esther, if things work out better?
Well, for me, your warning about polarization and polarization actually going up among the higher educated, I mean, clearly that is a warning sign. But my story was much more generalistic in a sense that I said if we fulfill these three conditions, we can take most people along, and therefore, yes, then the polarization hopefully would go away. But the point, or lower, become less. But the point I would also like to make is you touched upon the issue of government. And you said people have to be informed. And this reminds me that basically in the year 2019, we're dealing with a completely different way of doing politics and government and governance than we did, for example, in the time when we introduced natural gas in the Netherlands. Government has very much become about informing people, and then you sort yourself out. This is not taking people along. So what we need is also a different form of government that doesn't really stimulate the complete individualism whereby those people who can do the calculation and do the maths and have the money realize that they can have the solar panels and do a good investment onto their house. That information is there. I'm just a bit afraid that just informing will leave a group of people behind, and you need more initiative also from government to have the right kind of measures. For example, in the area of the financial products, again, we're very much leaving it to the market to develop these. But like in Germany, you do already for ages Bausparen. So you start saving, and hopefully in the end you will have the first amount to pay onto owning a house. You could do something similar in the area of climate. You do savings for a couple of years, and if you use that to make like a climate improvement on your house, you get a better interest, or the government will give you a plus. And if you don't spend it on climate, well, then you have saved an X amount of money and you can go to Greece. But you're better off if you actually spend it on climate. This is the kind of initiatives that I actually would demand, and that actually takes some more responsibility also, dare I say it in an EPP setting, from central government. Much more than just saying, here is the information, guys, deal with it. We have to look at how we do governance in this area as well, if we want to fix also the polarization.
Okay. Harmen?
Yeah, in my opinion, the polarization becomes more intense, especially led by the so-called populist parties. They argue that climate change, climate policies is something idiot because it cost hundreds of billions of euros only for the Netherlands. And a lot of people believe it. They make the lower and middle income classes afraid to take CO2 mitigation measures. They are simply lying, because in the recent climate plan issued by the Dutch government, a calculation has been made about the cost. They misuse that concept. They should talk about investment and not about cost, but they are using the terminology of cost. In total is for the year 2030 at most 0.5% of GDP. That is about 3.5 billion euros. That's it. And the populist parties argue that it boils down to more than 100,000 euros or even double. They simply add up everything that they can find and spread that message. And in that way, that's what I also noticed when participating in these panel discussions with an audience in Woerden, for instance, last week. And then, a group of people is sensitive to that message. And that makes it very difficult to come up with adequate, fair information about the possibilities that are available to take mitigation measures. And that has to do with the uncertainty that is still going around. That's the difficulty.
My parents currently live in the commune of Woerden, by the way. I grew up there, so now I'm worried that they might have been disbehaving in your
You're
meeting.
Not
but
don't worry.
One of the average.
But so I'm not pessimistic, but I try to find out where the problem is, and maybe if we see this hesitation of people, we also, like Esther mentioned, there was also a lot of hesitation among politicians. The EPP, ourselves, the CDA, has been critical in the Netherlands. Is it possible that has played a role, a negative role on it? That, I mean, if I'm a citizen and I see that politicians are a bit afraid to do something strong, then I learn, oh well, I mean, if the dikes would break in the Netherlands, we know what happens. Then all the action is there, and nobody is spared. All the houses are moved, and the dikes are increased. But the fact that it doesn't happen means that maybe it's not that serious. Is that the mechanism? And that politicians maybe play a role in that?
I think for sure that to an extent we have let it happen by being silent on the issue or being too careful on the issue and letting, other extremes be more vocal about it. But what I've tried to do by giving my examples to say that we Christian Democrats, seriously, if we build on the premise that every person is intrinsically inclined to look after their surroundings, we have the right message. Because, and this was a big debate and a big discussion among our communication staff in the CDA for one of our the spin doctors for one of our TV debates. I wanted to say, and they didn't find this very Christian democratic, I wanted to say, okay, so we have the Green Party that is basically always pointing the finger at you. You should do this, you should do that, you should. That scares people, except their own core audience, but a lot of people, it scares them. And then I said, and then you have the extreme right populists who are basically showing the middle finger, and this was the movement I wasn't allowed to make on TV, of course, clearly, the spin doctor said, but who are showing the middle finger to the next generation. Because what are we doing to our children? We're making it harder for them to still fix things if we don't do anything. So let us then be the helping hand, not the teacher or the vicar, not those who say, I don't care, because you burden the next generation with something they can't fix anymore, but the helping hand. And this is really, if I can talk in symbols, what we should be and what we should be a lot more vocal about. And to be very, very honest, I know the discussion in the Netherlands, but I also saw the reaction in the audience when you were actually painting this picture about, all the things that are now being communicated at once to a Dutch audience. So no more natural gas, whereas in most countries, moving from coal to natural gas is actually an improvement. No more natural gas. You will have to buy another heater. Nobody knows which one. You need a heat pump. Not if you live in a house from the 1920s like me, because the system doesn't work. So what do I then need to get? It is so much at once, and it is so abstract that my first premise, start small, is not there, and that is my biggest concern. I mean, today we have in the Netherlands, again, farmers in the street demonstrating against a lot of things and feeling angry that they get a lot of the blame in the climate discussion. How many people don't I hear in the Netherlands who tell me, if I knew that if I bought this kind of meat, it would be better for the environment and the farmer would get a better price, I would happily do that. But neither the market nor government is organizing that. We're just throwing the figures at them. Okay, so beef from Argentina has double the CO2 impact than beef from Europe. And then pork is half of that. And then a chicken is half of that again. Actually, chicken per kilo is rather close to tofu. So, we can give all these facts, but it doesn't help if we don't fix the system, which is anonymous meat, anonymous farmers, and not very well-informed choices for those who want to pay extra for a fair product. This is what we need to organize.
Harmen?
Yes, but in addition to Christian morality, to look after your neighbors and future generations, as an economist, I always simply argue that it also has to be made financially attractive. Otherwise, people won't do it. And that's the challenge. We have to create new financial instruments, perhaps like Bouwsparen, or together with one of the big banks in the Netherlands, to make it attractive for middle-income countries to take CO2 mitigating measures, that it is also in their advantage to overcome this short-sightedness. That's what it's all about.
Yes. And don't forget the European structural funds. I mean, we are now talking about people who are lucky enough to own their own house and to be able to make investments into improving their own house. This is not the average situation in much of the middle class all over Europe. They will be renting. You know, are you going to put money towards climate proofing a rented house? What if it's owned by a housing corporation? This is where our European structural funds should come in. Rather than finance the local roundabout, it should make sure that local social housing is made more climate proof. And we're helping with the European Investment Bank. But again, that's big. That is loans. That is the big corporations. We have to start smaller than that.
But lower class people who live in social housing complexes, they, what I explained, are more or less indifferent, but the only reaction they give on insulation measures in their social housing projects is the rent will go up. We have to pay more for that house, although their energy bill will go down. But the combination of these both instruments is also difficult to communicate.
Yeah, that maybe in case of state-regulated central housing, the rent shouldn't immediately go up.
No.
And this is what I mean with having smart and strong government there where it is actually needed. I really intrinsically disagree that some of these people that we call these people are actually my friends.
Yeah.
You know, we were 3 kids growing up in Zuid-Limburg, and one of my best friends is now a house mother living in a house like that. And another one of my best friends, we are all the same age, is now in schuldsanering. So he's paying off the debts that his ex-wife ran up. They both don't have much to spend. Yet they love their children in the same way and they want to take care of them and their environment in the same way. We just have to give them the tools to be able to do so. I find it sometimes very... I mean, I know what you're saying, and looking at it at an economist, and all the research is there that people in social housing, they care less, they make other decisions for their financing. All of that is true. But that's maybe because we don't really give them a choice. And therefore, we as decision makers, we as leaders, should also blame ourselves and start working at this.
But if I might throw in another curveball, which is like the way the economy works, is that we have prices, and prices, well, they change our behavior, or we select stuff. That's why economists always used to advocate the CO carbon tax, because then the government might not have to do that much. We make our own decisions, and then immediately this solar panel becomes much more attractive. The holiday to Greece becomes more expensive. Why is it that that doesn't solve enough? And I do know that even Elizabeth Warren stopped mentioning it because of her spin doctors. That's what the Economist said. Don't mention carbon tax because of the word tax. But still, this is like, as an economist, thinking about the economy, price signals, freedom.
Yes, I'm a firm believer in price signals. And I'm more than 30 years in the field of environmental economics, and I always advocated the introduction of CO2 taxes, or whatever you call it. Then there are 2 basic reactions. First, it is bad for our international competitiveness, and then you have the entire industry against you. And second, it's bad for lower income classes, lower and middle income classes. It changes the income distribution. And both are politically not viable. That's the main issue.
Explain a bit more, because I think both of them are clearly part of the European debate that we're having, independent of the fact that a carbon tax discussion in the EU would be under unanimity, hence difficult. But you will immediately get the discussion about carbon border adjustment in order to level the playing field. So that will be part of the discussion. And your second point was about the income distribution, which is in a way true. If you are part of the income bracket that spends a large part of their income on consumption, you pay a lot of VAT and you would pay quite a lot of carbon tax. So how to fix those hurdles?
Yes, they're very difficult to fix. That's exactly the problem. these initiatives taken to the carbon refunds for CO2 taxes or whatever, they are not in line with the WTO, and that made it impossible to introduce these border refunds or whatever, although of course perhaps it is now possible, but because we don't have a WTO anymore since Trump has become president and he simply neglects the WTO. And lower and middle income classes are more intensive of energy use and the use of environmental goods, and relatively speaking. And that's the main issue. Then you have to mitigate these effect on income distribution with rather huge tax changes in the tax system. That's possible, but the politicians have always been very reluctant to introduce these measures, only step by step and at a very low rate. We had in the Netherlands a very lengthy discussion on regulatory energy taxes. They are there, but only on gases and electricity, but from an economic point of view, a rather low standard. But for the consumer, for the households, they pay more than 50% on their energy bill on taxes already. And that should become then higher, and that makes it politically not viable.
So, but does it mean that if a CO2 tax is not viable, and we're going to need the government to, that automatically will have a bigger government intervention? Because then you cannot use the simple price signal and let the market do the work, but you're going to use, well, subsidies or communication programs, which might, and then there comes my worry about the trust in the government.
Yeah. The less you are able to introduce a nation or preferably EU-wide CO2 tax, the more governments have to spend on subsidies, regulation, and all kinds of other policies to change the behavior of the public and investments in industry.
You know, what my worry is in this discussion that is taking place in parallel in all the member states, in some more, in some less, but in all member states of the EU, is that now you see all these attempts to fix this at national level. Which does a number of things, but anything we do at a national level will make it more expensive and less effective, less efficient also, to actually meet our targets. So this is why my third point was we need a strong EU for this level playing field. And if we, in the international level playing field discussion about carbon leakage and carbon border and whatever, if we don't, it's too easy to say, oh, that's difficult or currently not possible in WTO, because this has to do with trust. If you demand via the ETS system or via a carbon tax that our producers, pay a certain price for the right to emit carbon, you don't demand that from other parts of the world. Your level playing field is gone. The impact on a global level will be relatively small. Yes, the investment will leak away, the jobs will leak away. So I don't really care whether the system is based on a cap and trade system or whether it is based on a carbon tax system, but it has to be able to deliver some form of level playing field. Otherwise, these trust issues are going to appear. And my worry is just people are so in love with carbon taxes at the moment, and then they very easily say, but then at a European level. Okay, I've just explained. Our rules are that means unanimity. There's always one member state that will stand up and will say no. Plus, this whole discussion about a carbon tax means that we also have to do away with a system that is finally starting to somewhat work, which is the just fixed ETS system. I just mentioned the additional rights are out of the market. The price went from 5 to 27 euros, and it will take years to create a new system. I'm a bit afraid that we'll be having a long systematic discussion.
That is too slow.
We should actually be working with what we currently have. But the catch-22 is indeed, if you want border adjustment, then you can't also have carbon leakage within the ETS, because that would make it non-WTO proof. This is the link between the two discussions.
Yeah. And
That is currently holding us hostage, in a way.
And in addition, there is also a technical, rather complex technical problem in introducing and using border adjustments. Because if you import a bicycle, for instance, from China, how do you know how much CO2 is incorporated in the production of that particular bicycle?
A Dutch person should never import a bicycle from China.
Why not? They are the most popular, most sold bicycles.
It's a shame.
Or maybe it's a Dutch bicycle made in China.
Yeah, or even within the EU, or is it produced by nuclear energy or coal? You cannot see it when you buy the bicycle. That makes it also very complex. And there is another relevant political issue with respect to carbon taxes, and that is that the result of a carbon tax, what is get out of the market, goes to the Minister of Finance. And if you send some money to the Minister of Finance, you're lost.
In some countries they will spend it. In the Netherlands he keeps it a bit too much.
But or whatever, you never see it again. And that also makes it politically very difficult, the returns of the carbon taxes.
Yeah.
Let me suggest to take some questions from the audience. I see there one, two. Shall we take them at the same time and then we'll answer, Maybe state your name. And
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Czarnocki. I'm trained at EPP Group in European Parliament, but of course I'm speaking on my behalf. Thank you for this conversation. It's really to the point. I have two issues. So, EU globally is not such a big emittent, and I'm afraid that we don't have, except trade, we don't trade, let's say it bluntly, blackmailing, we don't have much leverage to talk with China or with US, and what US is doing right now is just like, well, no one knows what to do with them. So that's a huge issue. The second issue is that, no offense, but I had like impression that when talking here about solving this problem of going green in EU, that still whole talk here was more or less about burdening middle class, actually. And let's say it bluntly, it's not about blaming, but it was big business who for decades were denying and financing climate change denialism. Even like saying climate change, it was at the outset, it was global warming. Then there was like this 2000s when they spin it to the climate change, so it's not getting to the point that actually we are warming. So why not actually burden them more? And here was the talk, I was thinking during the discussion, like why not tax them? And then Professor Ries said that, well, that's competitiveness, that's a lot of problems. So are we not able to like make some more complicated financial engineering to figure out some financial instruments that it will not be so hurting for business? So for example, I don't know, some green obligations, so the firms will have to buy green obligations, but which will have some terms like 10 years, so they will have some stake in investing in green, and that will go to some dedicated fund to invest into some green transformation. That was just my initial idea. Like, it's super simple idea, but the point is not to concentrate on this particular idea, just to be more creative, just go beyond the green tax. So thank you very much.
Yeah, someone I think at the front. Doesn't matter.
Angela, it's all.
It's good. I am professor of. I work with Swedish Lolea University and here with Versalius, but I do research on green economic transition. And some 10 years ago in Vilnius, I am Lithuanian, been an event of Union European Federalists about climate change. It's been Danish researchers, etc., and they've been presenting data, which I know also about middle class, that in up to 2050, let's say, especially in Asia, India, China, Southeast Asia, middle class will grow a lot and the population grow, and they start consume more and more, and that in order to tackle climate change we have to educate Asian consumers already. So to your opinion, let's say, and then debate started about if we can succeed, let's say, with this 1.5 or even 2 Celsius degree of warming, and Danish representative said that yes, we did a lot in the last already few years, but doesn't matter, CO2 emission still increases. So what is your, let's say, opinion? What is probability, 50%, 70%, that globally we can succeed limiting warming, let's say, by end of century at 2 degrees Celsius? Thank you.
So the probability of reaching the target. Yeah. Okay.
Cheers, thanks. Ivan Delibasic used to work for the Martin Center and had the pleasure also of advising late President Martins. So I'll be speaking as an external friend of the EPP. First of all, I would like to thank Ms. Lange for covering all 3 main points I made in the previous session, being small and practical, issue of Western European-centric approach, and climate diplomacy. I will try not to challenge you too much, but I will be provocative a bit, if you don't mind. As Vice Chair of the Group for Economy and Environment, you do have quite a challenging task. Even the latest set of amendments coming from the EPP Group on COP25, INI report, suggested there are quite a bit of differences between approaches of different parties in EPP, and we could tell it from the previous panel where messages were quite different from this one. So my first question would be how to reconcile those differences within the EPP, and how can EPP speak with one voice, and then only we can expect the EU to speak with one voice. Second one is the title of the panel is Financing the Future, or Investing in the Future. Investing in the Future. One of the main aspects of it will be sustainable finance, and that is the file that your colleagues hopefully on Monday will get the mandate to start the trialogue with the Council. Question there is, you mentioned that transition is not going to be the same for everyone. EIB decided to postpone their decision on fossil fuel subsidies phase out for a month and a half. But you mentioned that moving from coal to gas would already be a leap forward for many countries. So is there something that we can do to ensure your colleagues that maybe sustainable finance can still include some aspects, and what do you consider to be climate mitigating thing? And the last one would be, I'll kind of link to yours on climate diplomacy. Aside from using trade policy as our main vehicle and main tool in our toolbox, is there something practical that we can do? Can we include private sector in developing solutions that then can be applicable? I mean, we have a situation in Rotterdam where we have a quite successful carbon capture plant. So is there something that as Europeans we can do in investing not just in environmental solutions, but also in research and development and innovation that can be applicable elsewhere, and then kind of try to include that in our toolbox for climate diplomacy? Sorry, I was a little bit long, but...
Okay, 3 questions. Wants to go first? You?
Yeah, because it's quite a lot. You started with the 10% to say, okay, globally the EU is only responsible for 10% of emissions, and a lot of people start their contribution when it, when they have to say something about climate change with that. But for a lot of people, it's an excuse to then say, and therefore the EU should not be in the forefront because we're only 10%. And I think that's a mistake. And this is what I meant with this normative power. If we want to convince others to take measures, then the power is that it's not what we do or what we say in global meetings, etc. It's what we are as Europeans. It is what we believe is the right thing, which is to be at the forefront here. If we weren't at the forefront, we would not be convincing others. So yes, trade is in our toolbox, but our own behavior is also in our toolbox, because this shows that if you tackle things the right way, it can be done, and it can be done responsibly. So trade, yes, we can bribe, like you say, or blackmail via our trade contacts, but that wouldn't work if we wouldn't practice what we preach, and if we wouldn't be at the forefront. And that is in a way also linked to what you say about the private sector. Can we set the scene so that they help? No, I think this innovation is crucial for the survival of the EU and for the chances that the generation of my son, who's currently 8, will actually have. I mean, if we want them to, we were, in 1900, we were 25% of global population as Europeans. Therefore, you automatically set the norm. It's just, you know, you're big and you determine what goes on in the world. We're currently around 7% of global population. We will soon be 5%. So the question for these 5%, and it's not because we are shrinking so much, it's because the others are growing so much. So are we going to let others set the norm? That would be to our detriment. Are we then going to compete on price? We will never be the cheapest pair of hands, hopefully, in the world. Or is the generation of my son going to grow up with the idea we can always be ahead of the pack when it comes to inventing smart solutions also for climate change? And I'm spending way too much time on this question, but I'm doing that because I really think this is fundamental for the survival of the EU and the chances that the next generation will have, because it's their job. It's their fair chance at a good life as well. On the EIB issue and the smart financial products, I'm very proud to come from the member states where, we just issued our first, I think we were the first in Europe to issue actually a green bond in terms of financial products from the government. Yes, I will vote on the taxonomy report on Monday. We should carry that forward. It came up in a lot of hearings with responsible commissioners, so it will be one of the key issues of this new commission. And it was lovely that you actually said, I was thinking this as a solution. Ursula von der Leyen was also thinking that as a solution, so you are definitely going the right way in the sense that she wants the EIB to be Europe's climate bank. And, there's a lot of details we should then discuss, but I think the line is there and this is the right direction to take. Then you have little hurdles, like if moving from fossil to gas is a huge improvement in a number of member states, can it for a period of time still be green finance? And I think it should be, because these targets can never be absolute. They're not a move in the right direction in the Netherlands. They are a huge improvement in Poland. And we should be brave enough to say that and to distinguish between that. And that is also it takes some political courage to do that, because it's very easy to leave the people who make the models and the abstract things for all of us and the statistics do the job. No, these kind of choices to say in some cases you have to treat different cases, similar cases in different ways, is a political choice that I think we should support. What else was
the probability that we reach the target?
I'm not going to go there. I will leave that to the IPPC to come up with these numbers. I will work very hard to make sure that we do fulfill, the targets that we set ourselves. And if that means that we're currently not en route to meet Paris, then we should actually tighten the laws that we have in this area at a European level. Let me the EPP question. How can I, as vice chair of the group responsible for climate and other things, make sure that the EPP speaks with one voice? It can be done. The ETS dossier shows that it can be done. You just have to have a lot of understanding for the different national positions that people come from. And I honestly think, I don't want to insult anyone coming from a big country now, but the fact that it was a Dutch person and a Belgian person working on the ETS dossier, it really helped. Because we are so small that we will never push something through basically just on on our size only. So we have to take all these different things into account. And if I see the result compared to what the EPP position was, we got there. But you were right, the biggest hurdle was first within the group, and that was manageable. Let me finish with, it is more important than ever that not only we as EPP, but other big groups of the middle take the same responsibility. It is always very easy to do opposition politics. But if you're not careful, every political party in Brussels will be doing opposition politics, and who will take responsibility? After the elections, I said it will now really be down to the constructive, cooperative, middle parties to make sure that they give and take, but build coalitions large enough to make sure that we keep this European Union going in the right direction. And that would be my wish for the 5 years to come. I will do whatever I can to make that happen.
Harmen?
I will try to address the other questions. To start,
All of them?
no, not of all.
Also
To start with
the probability?
not the probably. The question from the lady from Sweden, if I understood you well. You argue, and that's also often mentioned, of course, and that always make me a bit depressive, arguing that there is population growth, and if the Chinese and the Indians become richer, they're going to emit even more CO2. So what is the use of all this? Yeah, then I would say, then you better stop if you take it that way. But my reply is, when these countries become richer, wealthier, then they are also going to take care of the environment. That is the so-called Kuznets curve. That takes time, and don't be mistaken. As well, you don't like China, me neither.
No,
but
we need China in this regard to work together very much.
But in China, they have in some fields very aggressive and very technologically advanced CO2 mitigating technologies in place. They also have still, I think, about 1,000 coal plants, but nonetheless, they are active in that field. And not only they become richer, and then the population growth will go down, and they will take care of the environment, but what we can do now is also to help them technologically, the other countries except India and China, with technology transfers and exchange of technology. That's also part of the Paris Agreement. So that gives you a perspective for action, and not be too pessimistic about the population growth. Otherwise, we would have stopped in 1798 when Malthus published his essay on population. Huh? Isn't it? That was also, from a technological point of view, a mistaken scenario. Okay.
If he was right, the room would have been a bit fuller.
Yes. Yeah. The other question, if I understood you well, is why don't we introduce a CO2 tax on industry? That's obligations are more engaging. Yeah. Okay. Let me give you the Dutch example. 40% of our CO2 emissions originate from industry. 60% of that 40%, that's 24%, originate in 12 energy-intensive firms, oil refineries, chemical industries, and so on. They have to participate in the ETS trading system. And the price of a permit is going up nowadays thanks to the actions taken by the European community. In addition, under pressure of rather left-wing politicians in the Netherlands, the government considers the introduction over and above the permit price of a CO2 tax for industry. It's not known yet what that particular tax will look like, but one thing is sure, they will look after it in such a way that the international competitiveness of these firms is not harmed. That's what it's all about. That means that they will introduce a CO2 tax, and then it goes to the Ministry of Finance, and he immediately returns it in the form of subsidies for newer technologies, something like that. And then, yeah, you have them on board as well, so to say. But it's a rather complex thing, tax. Only 2 questions I addressed.
There's probably more questions, but one question I thought about is the Extinction Rebellion, which is now taking place in a lot of cities in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, I guess. Is there anything that will be enough for people who say we don't do enough? So, my frame is that, I mean, you hear not just activists, but a lot of people saying we are not doing enough. That is the line.
Yeah.
Will anything be is there a way to communicate anything that will give some trust to people who think we are not doing enough? The comparison maybe with like water damage is easy. Like if the Netherlands, like if the rivers flood or whatever, you can just point to the waterworks and you can say, this is what we're doing. But because we cannot see CO2, you see the point?
Yeah, I'm always rather also rather pessimistic about that issue. Then one comes up with where we need a disaster, and then people will act. But yeah, in my opinion, we don't have to wait to have a disaster and act before the disaster. But in fact, these heat spells and storms becoming heavier, not more frequent, but they become heavier, and everything that's going on around the world. And it's also in the media, I would say that would give the general public the impression that this is a very serious problem, that we have to act in one way or another. I don't know what you can do more. In that way, the press is on our side. Yeah.
You should never base your decisions, whether it's in life or in politics, on the smallest group of most radicalized people. And what I find with a very small part, but a part that we need to watch of these movements, is that they are anti-system. Yeah. They are anti-everything. Break it first and then rebuild again. What will happen is especially to break it first. And this is why I'm very careful with the most radicalized part of those movements. What I'm proud of, and which also as an EPP politician I've never condemned. There were those who said when the school strikes started, you know, these kids should be in school. I think it is actually rather refreshing that school kids are actually going out onto the street for something again. You know, I'm either at the end of one generation or the beginning of Generation X, which is like the generation that wasn't bothered about anything, so they could cut our student grants and everything, and we weren't even bothered to go out in the streets. I think it's rather refreshing that young people now are, and this I will never ever say anything negative against. But the most extreme examples that we are now seeing that are anti-system is something that we should not wish upon ourselves. No. Let's put it that way, and that definitely shouldn't base our decisions on.
Yes, I do agree.
Okay. Yeah. Now, let's say 2 questions, something from the audience. Yeah, in the back. Yes. And then there. Yeah, we stop even.
My name is Thomas Brandner. I work for the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union.
Very good.
In an attempt to reduce a bit the burden on the middle class, a question on 2 technologies that might contribute to the solution of the climate problem. How, in your opinion, is the impact of reforestation? There was recently a big study about it. And how, in your opinion, what in your opinion could be the impact of carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and usage technologies. Thank you very much.
Other question over there? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This wonderful panel discussion. I love it. My name is Petri Lahesmaa. One example about the radical groups. I was a couple of weeks ago visiting Cologne, and then there's acting against climate change, which is a good thing, but was acting quite strange way because they were sitting and blocking the tram rails. So finally I was forced to take the taxi to not miss my train back to Brussels. But yes, we need regulation. We have to change the way we are living. We have to create new incentives for people to invest, to isolate their houses, etc. But are we in the EPP family a bit too shy to say it another way? I was listening my compatriot Jyrki Katainen 2 weeks ago, and he also reminded that fighting against climate change is also the huge opportunity for research, for innovations, for academia, for businesses, small and medium price, we always have to remind that, the big businesses, the jobs, creating new jobs, and to have the sustainable growth. Are we too shy to say that? Because I think it is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, we need to close in time, so if you're okay.
That sounds very much like Jyrki. And it is good to always have that side of it, put in the spotlight as well. It was part of my answer to one of the questions about the research. It's not only an opportunity, it's a must for a continent like Europe. The only problem is, of course, that the gains in terms of opportunities, research, innovation, the gains of that go to different people than the people who lose out. And we know the regions exactly. It's Silesia in Poland, it is Galicia in Spain, all the numbers are there. Those are the regions that really are confronted with mass unemployment when we close coal plants. And you don't turn a coal plant worker immediately into an ICT startup nerd. And this is basically the challenge that we have, that we also have to do the permanent training, the reskilling where we can, and the just transition. But you're absolutely right, it is also an opportunity, but we have to make sure that we also take the others along. Carbon capture and storage, and more importantly, use. I think in the short term it is of fundamental importance to meet our targets. We have this key development in Rotterdam where not only we are storing but also trying to reuse some of the carbon, for example, in greenhouses. So, you would probably start talking maybe wasserbomben, but the tomatoes are quite nice that grow there. And if we can do so in a sustainable way, I think it is a good example of a win-win situation. The reforestation, I'm not an expert in it coming from the Netherlands. I know it was a huge part of Mr. Timmermans' introductory speech in his hearing. And even if it doesn't have the huge scientific impact that some say it might have, because you can say the same thing about sugar beet, by the way, as you can say about trees. Sugar beet is a crop that binds a lot of CO2. Nobody knows this, but instead of saying I want millions of trees, you can say I want millions of sugar beet. But even if you can dispute how big the impact is, I think this is a lovely example of taking people along. It shouldn't be your main measure. It shouldn't be the core of your policy. However, this is something tangible that shows people, you could even say, this is my tree, this is my contribution, this is what I did. And in that regard, it will in any case be helpful.
Yes, to follow up and brief, both measures you mentioned are very promising measures, but both, and that's from an economic point of view, are expensive measures. Reforestation sounds cheap, but it is not the tree that costs the money, but the land. And land have alternative uses, and that makes it expensive. And it takes about 20 years for a tree to grow, and during that period it takes up CO2. It's a very good measure, but again it is expensive. And CCS and geoengineering is also a very promising technique. Geoengineering to take out CO2 from the atmosphere, but also that's rather expensive at the moment. And CCS is also still very expensive. Yeah, but for the future, my hope is partly based on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me thank the speakers.
Okay.
Thank you all for being here.
Mooi op tijd, strak.